Hello and welcome to episode 3 of the Endpoint Equation. This is the podcast where we break down the real-world variables behind endpoint management. My name's Liam and today we're diving into one of the most quietly significant infrastructure events to hit enterprise Windows environments in years, the expiry of Microsoft Secure Boot certificates. I know what some of you are thinking, certificates, firmware, UEFI, sounds dry, but stick with me because this one genuinely matters, and more importantly, the way it was handled raises some real questions about how Microsoft communicates these things to people responsible for running enterprise estates. If you're an IT admin or EUC leader managing Windows devices at scale, this episode is directly relevant to your world right now. And if you're not yet feeling the pain from this, there's a good chance some of your devices are already quietly sitting in a degraded security state without a single warning being raised. Let's get into it. First, a quick primer on Secure Boot, and I'll keep this practical rather than academic. Secure Boot is a UEFI firmware security feature introduced with Windows 8 back in 2012. Its job is simple. In concept, make sure that every piece of code that runs before Windows loads has been digitally signed by a trusted source. So that means your bootloader, your drivers, early startup components, all of it has to pass a cryptographic check before the OS even begins loading. And why does this matter? Because the boot process is exactly where sophisticated attackers want to operate. Before the OS loads, before your antivirus is running, before Defender's woken up. That's prime real estate for something called a bootkit. Now this sits below the operating system, making it nearly invisible to traditional security tools, and it can persist even through a full Windows reinstall. Secure Boot closes that window, so it works through a layered key hierarchy stored in your device's UEFI firmware. At the top of that hierarchy is the platform key, so that's owned by the OEM, so Dell, HP, Lenovo, so on. Beneath that is the key exchange key, or KEK, and that's where Microsoft sits. So the KEK is the credential that authorises Windows Update to add new entries to the trusted and revoked signature databases. Those databases, called the DB and the DBX, are what Secure Boot actually checks at runtime. So when we talk about the 2026 certificate expiry, we're not talking about something cosmetic. We're talking about the cryptographic infrastructure that underpins your entire boot security posture. And the specific certificates that expired this month, the ones issued back in 2011, have been present in the UEFI firmware of virtually every Windows PC shipped since Windows 8. That's over 1 billion devices worldwide, including yours. Let's be precise about what happened because there's a fair amount of confusion in the press around this. There are actually multiple certificates involved and they're expiring on slightly different dates. The Microsoft Corporation KEK CA 2011, that's the key exchange key, expired on the 24th of June 2026. The UEFI CA 2011, which covers third-party bootloaders and option ROMs, expired on June 27th. As a third certificate, the Windows Production PCA 2011 is set to expire on the 19th of October 2026, so that deadline is still ahead of us as of this recording. These aren't the platform keys, Microsoft doesn't own that, the OEMs do, but these are the certificates that authorise Windows Update to push changes to the boot trust chain. When the KEK expired, that authorisation pathway closed. No new boot level security updates can reach devices that haven't already received the 2023 replacement certificates. Here's the part that catches people off guard. Your devices didn't stop booting, Windows still loads, standard updates still install, and nothing's visibly broken as of 27th of June. That's actually part of the problem because the damage is invisible. What you lose on a device that hasn't migrated to the new 2023 certificate is everything forward-looking. So the DBX, the revocation list that blocks known malicious bootloaders, is frozen. Attacks like Black Lotus, a sophisticated UEFI bootkit that made headlines a few years ago and was addressed through DBX updates, will remain trusted on unpatched devices. New bootloaders signed only against the 2023 certificates won't be trusted, and critically, future Windows feature updates may fail to install because they'll come signed with the keys the device doesn't recognise. Microsoft began issuing the replacement 2023 certificates back in 2022 and has been dual signing boot components with both the old and the new certificates since then. The new certificates, valid through 2038, are already on many devices. but the rollout has been deliberately cautious and for good reason. Pushing firmware changes to millions of devices is genuinely a difficult engineering problem, but we'll get there in a moment. Difficulty is not the whole story. Now here's where I want to be honest and direct, because I think this episode would be incomplete without it. Microsoft could have done better here, and I say that as someone who appreciates the technical complexity involved. The 2011 certificates were issued in 2011. That's always had an expiry date. This wasn't a surprise from a Microsoft internal perspective. The transition planning began around 2022, so Microsoft started dual signing in October 2025, but meaningful, prominent communication, that came too late in my opinion. For most admins managing Windows devices through Intune or Configuration Manager, this topic didn't prominently surface until late 2025, and for many, not until early 2026. Microsoft held an Ask Microsoft Anything session on Secure Boot in March, and that was just 3 months before the first certificate expired. There's a certain irony in hosting a clarification Q&A 3 months before a deadline that was baked in 15 years ago. The questions that came out of that AMA tell you everything about the awareness gap. Admins were asking basic questions. Does a blanket policy push, break things? What happens to Pixie Boot? What about BitLocker recovery loops? These aren't edge case concerns, they're bread and butter enterprise scenarios. In fact, the fact those questions are still being asked in March 2026 suggests the communication failed. And the answers weren't always reassuring, so Microsoft explicitly advised against blanket deployment of the Secure Boot update policy across entire fleets. Some HP commercial laptops ended up in BitLocker recovery loops during the rollout. Pixie Boot broke in some environments after the old certificates were revoked because boot.wim images were still signed against 2011 keys. And these are real operational incidents that admins had to deal with. To Microsoft's credit, they did actually produce a detailed playbook, tooling for Intune and group policy deployment, PowerShell modules for querying certificate states, reporting dashboards in Intune. These resources are good, but the timing and the volume of communication, and proactive communication specifically, leading up to this should have been much better and much louder. There's also a visibility problem that Microsoft hasn't fully solved. There's no Intune report that surfaced this clearly until recently. The get secure boot UEFI PowerShell command exists, but this output isn't particularly useful without additional scripting. And for something this consequential, the visibility gap should have been closed years ago and not months before the deadline. Let's make this practical. If you're listening to this and you're not sure where your device fleet stands, here's what to do. So the first step is inventory. In Intune, there's now a Secure Boot status report available. Go to your endpoint security section and look for the Secure Boot compliance status. For devices that aren't in Intune, you can use the PowerShell command, checking for the string, the KEK2K CA 2023. If that returns true, the device has been migrated. If not, it's still on the 2011 certificate. You can also go and check in Windows Security, under Device Security, Secure Boot. If there's a green badge confirming all certificates are applied, that means you're good. For devices that need updating, you have a few options. So most devices will often receive the new certificates automatically through Windows Update, but in enterprise environments, we often have update deferral policies that may have blocked this. You can explicitly enable the Secure Boot certificate deployment policy in Intune through the settings catalog, or via group policy if you have the Secure Boot ADMX in your central store. But, and this is important, don't push this to your entire fleet simultaneously without testing first. So test a representative sample of your specific hardware models. The HP BitLocker recovery loop issue I mentioned earlier is a clear example of why hardware diversity matters here. Pixie Boot environments need their boot.wim images re-signed against the 2023 certs before you revoke trust in the old ones. Virtual machines, particularly Azure Trusted Launch VMs and Hyper-V guests, have their own update paths that differ from physical hardware. For devices that cannot genuinely receive the updates, older hardware where the OEM has stopped providing firmware updates, your options are more limited. Those devices will continue to boot and function normally, but their DBX is frozen at its current state, and they won't receive future boot security updates. You'll need to assess the risk tolerance for those devices based on what they do and what data they're accessing. Now the third Microsoft certificate The Windows Production PCA 2011 doesn't expire until October 19th, 2026. So you still have a window to get the rest of your fleet sorted before that second deadline hits, and I suggest you use it. So here's the question I want to end on, because I think it's the most important one for a long-term IT strategy. The new 2023 certificates are valid until 2038, so that's just 12 years from now. So we have a window to think about this properly before we're back in the same boat in 2037 or 2038. The honest answer to what happens in 2038 is we don't know yet. Microsoft have not published a formal roadmap for the next certificate generation. There's no public commitment to an earlier phased rollout of the certificate updates, but we can draw some lessons from 2026 that should shape how the industry approaches this as a whole. I think first, firmware level changes need to be treated as infrastructure events and not software updates. The reason this cycle has caused so much pain is that most enterprise patching processes are built around software. Firmware is different. It's slower, it's OEM dependent, it can brick devices if done wrong, and it requires coordination between Microsoft, hardware vendors and IT teams. Treating it with the same urgency and planning as a major OS migration could be the right model in the context of secure boot certificates. Secondly, certificate lifecycle management needs to be a first-class feature in endpoint management platforms. Intune should, and increasingly does, surface certificate health alongside device compliance, but this should be continuous and automatic, and not something you have to go looking for. If Microsoft builds certificate expiry monitoring directly into the Intune compliance engine, with clear dashboards and automated alerting years in advance of a deadline, then the 2038 cycle would look very different from the 2026 one. Difference would be we're prepared. Third, OEM coordination needs to happen earlier. There's a reason some older devices can't receive 2023 certificates, and that isn't a Microsoft problem. It's a firmware problem owned by OEMs who have stopped supporting those models. Enterprise device procurement strategies should increasingly factor in firmware support commitments alongside standard software support life cycles. If a vendor can't commit to firmware updates for the working life of a device, then that's a risk. And finally, and this is perhaps the most forward-looking point, the UEFI Forum, which is the standards body behind Secure Boot, they should be pushing for certificate lifecycle automation. The 2038 certificate should come with automated pre-expiry notifications built into the UEFI spec, so devices surface their own certificate health status through standardized channels that management tools can then query. Some of that groundwork's already being laid, but it needs to move faster than the industry has so far shown it's willing to. So, to bring this together, the 2026 Secure Boot certificate expiry is a real event with real security consequences for enterprise fleets. Devices didn't stop booting on the 27th of June, but unpatched devices are now frozen in their boot security posture, unable to receive new revocations or trust new bootloaders. So the operational risk is real, and it will grow over time as new threats emerge. And Microsoft have handled the technical transition reasonably well in terms of what they've built, the tooling, the policies, the Intune integration and reports. But where they fell short was the timing and volume of communication, and in the visibility tooling that should have been in your hands years earlier. The good news, if your fleet isn't fully migrated yet to the new certificates, you still have time before October. I think it's the October 19th deadline for the final 2011 certificates, and I suggest you use it. If you found this episode of the Endpoint Equation useful, share it with someone in your team who needs to hear it, and if you've got a war story from your own Secure Boot rollout, or you've got thoughts on what Microsoft should do differently ahead of 2038, I'd genuinely love to hear it, so drop me a comment or a message wherever you're listening from. Thanks for listening to the Endpoint Equation, and I'll catch you in the next one.